My great pleasure to welcome you all to the first lecture of the summer 2025 CAS-E semester. My name is Kelly Hayes, and it's a joy to introduce Dr. Stephen Engler, who I have known in the virtual world for quite a while now, but we have never actually been in the same physical space. So it's just a delight to have the opportunity to introduce him to you. And also thrilled to have more Brazilianists here. Professor Engler is Professor of Religious Studies at Mount Royal University in Canada. He was a visiting professor for 2 years at PUC São Paulo. So that is the university, the Pontifical University. I actually never said that in English, but I think it's something like that. Pontifical University. Universidade Pontifícia Católica de São Paulo. He's also the editor of the journal Religion. He has been extremely prolific in the field of religious studies in questions of research methods, but also in terms of Brazil as an area. So he edited the Routledge Handbook of Research Methods in the Study of Religion, which has 2 editions now. He also edited the Oxford Handbook in the Study of Religion and the Brill Handbook of Contemporary Religions in Brazil, which is where we first met. He is a specialist in a variety of spirit-oriented religions in Brazil, including Umbanda, Kardecism, and Quimbanda. And he also has a long-standing interest in issues of theory, method, and meta-theory. And I wanted to sort of give a little bit of a more personal introduction as well, because Stephen is someone who, in the field of religious studies, if you're studying Brazil, he knows all of the literature, like all of the most obscure titles. And so I always know that if I'm writing something, I can write to Stephen and he will tell me exactly what I need to read and where, and he's such a generous colleague, he will send it to you. So he's an incredible wealth of information. And I'm delighted actually that we're starting with Lodoya Eshu. Eshu is the one who opens the pathways. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Engler.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Thanks to the directors for having me here. So why would I start by saying Larodia Eshu Eshu Mojuba? Why would I praise an African entity, especially a rather ambiguous one? Good, bad, protector, dangerous? Well, there are 3 reasons for that. The first reason is because a particularly powerful Eshu, Sete Encruzilhadas, 7 Crossroads, is one of 3 entities that I'm told is protecting me and guiding me in my research. The 2 are the Virgin Mary and a small child spirit that I'll talk about later. But the one I'm worried about is the Eshu, so credit where credit is due. The second reason is once I was at a terreiro, this is partly why I have to evoke this Eshu, because there's another Eshu who I worry about. I went to Quimbanda with a friend of mine, and I'm a bit irritating with Brazilians who ask me my name, because Brazilians will phone, and when you pick up the phone, they say, "Who's speaking?" My reaction is, "You phoned me. Who are you?" But I just say, "Stephen." And they say, "Who? Stephen? Who?" And then I might go, "Steven." Oh. So I was in this terreiro, and one of the cambonos came by, the ritual assistant said, "Anyone want to speak to the Eshu spirit of the house?" So I wanted to get on that list. He said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Stephen." And my friend who knew the game said, "Chico." His name's Chico, short for Francisco. So I corrected. I said, "No, my name's Steven." So when I was called in, I went in to talk to this extremely powerful Eshu, Sete Caveiras, 7 skulls, and he said, "Seu Chico, que tem aí?" And then I thought, what am I supposed to do with this? Because if he's really an Eshu, he knows my name isn't Chico. So maybe I should confess it. But on the other hand, maybe that's the wrong thing to do. Maybe the Eshu is going to appreciate the fact that I'm going to lie to his face on this one. So I'm still worried about that issue, but hopefully if something happens, it'll happen to someone named Chico. But the third reason is because evangelicals think that this is Satan. And why do evangelicals think it's Satan? Because they have very rigid categories: God, devil, good, evil. And if there's a message or a thesis to this presentation, it's that rigid categories are not useful. Rigid definitions are not useful. You have to use a more fluid definition, which guides research, but doesn't contain research. So the Eshu, who crosses boundaries, who transgresses as part of his nature, Eshu who's from the street, one of us, Eshu who needs to learn from us as much as we need to learn from him, is a good place to start. And so with the ugly font, we'll continue. This study, I interviewed not quite 30 people. About 40% of them were medical doctors. About 40% of them were Spiritist practitioners in Kardecism or Umbanda. About 20% of them were both, medically trained and an alternative practitioner. So we'll be looking at some of that data. On the right is the hospital in the city, Santa Casa, where most of the people I interviewed work. On the left is a very important healer from Umbanda and Kimbanda, Zé Pilintra, someone else who is from the street, who will help you, but might not help you in the way you expect to be helped, a great healer, different views of healing. But I also wanted to point to another sense of ambiguity. At the beginning of my research, I was oriented by a very powerful experience, but it was an academic experience, not a religious experience. A friend of mine, who I've known since I was first there, told me his sister went to a candomblé. So I said, take me with you. She said, let's go to the candomblé. So she, my friend and I got in a car and we drove 40 kilometers across the border to Minas Gerais, where the Afro-Brazilian traditions are more traditional. And we went into the candomblé. And I got in, and there was a bunch of chairs all facing forward, an open space. And I said, funny, I hadn't been to many theaters of candomblé. This looks like Umbanda. And then someone came by and took 20 reais from me to see the spirit of the house. And I said, this definitely doesn't seem like candomblé, and I'm not so sure it's Umbanda. And then the spirits came in, the mediums came in, all the men dressed in black started lighting up cigars, and all the women in red, Eshus and Pombagiras, and I knew I was in Kimbanda. So the interesting thing was, on the ride home, I started the trip home, about a 40-minute trip, thinking, this woman doesn't even know what religion she's going to. And then it didn't take long for me to think, how pretentious is that of me? Clearly, this woman doesn't care what religion she's going to. And that's the point here. So I talked to her more, and really to understand what she was doing there, it doesn't matter what religion it is. All that matters is what religious services are available. So to understand why she was there, I learned a lot more talking to my sister-in-law, who also owns a gym in the city. And this woman is known as a bit of a cutthroat businesswoman. And that's why she's there paying for ritual sacrifice. It's a part of her business practice. So I began to see that to understand why people do things, I can't let myself be contained by labels of traditions, and I can't let myself be contained by religious things. Here, the business angle, both in the Terreiro and in her business, is important. Here's some basic numbers on Brazil. The story most people know, Catholicism's dropping. The 2022 census figures are supposed to be out any month now, but other studies suggest we're probably down to 50 to 55% Catholic. Number of no religions going up. The big story among Protestants is not Pentecostalism rising, but it's slowing growth, and the dramatic rise of people who are unaffiliated Protestants who circulate between different Protestant churches. Let's look at the esoteric corner of the survey. Kardecism is an esoteric tradition from France, whereas Umbanda is usually categorized as an Afro-Brazilian tradition. I make an argument that that's not a good way to categorize it for two reasons. First, there are a lot of terreiros of Umbanda which have nothing African in them at all. No drums. Preto velho, yes, but not necessarily in the traditional interpretation. No mention of orixás. So you can either just conclude it's not really Umbanda if you predetermine it as Afro-Brazilian. But we don't know the history of Umbanda. We don't know where it started, how we have our different stories. And the worst story is the scholarly story, that it began as the whitening of candomblé, coincidentally at exactly the same time as the blackening of Kardecism, coincidentally exactly at the same time as the presence of indigenous spirits, coincidentally exactly at the same time that Brazil forged its racist myth of three races in the 1930s. So the scholarly account, I've come to think of it, though I used to echo it myself, is not very trustworthy. But the other reason is Umbanda's entitology is Kardecist. Reincarnation, spiritual evolution, charity. It's not an Afro-Brazilian religion. What it is a Spiritist tradition, hybridizing in this context, which usually presents features of African religious traditions. Esoteric traditions, about a third of Asian religions could be categorized as esoteric, using the standard definitions. And some other Afro-Brazilian religions are esoteric. So we're up to less than 2.5%, but that's a big chunk of a population of 200 million people. Say on the census they're esoteric, but probably as many as 30, 40 million people regularly go to the rituals of esoteric traditions. But underline the key point, the largest non-Christian religions in the country are esoteric. So some issues with the category of religion to start with. First, people in Brazil don't stay put. So if you want to study what people are doing religiously, you can't tie it down to any particular religion because they're moving between religions. Second, a lot of people say they belong, the census numbers are not high, but when you talk to people, that they belong to two different religions. What are you? I'm Catholic. But where do you go? Well, I go to Kardecism. In addition, there's something I'll talk about more, ritual polyphony, where you get multiple religions in the same group. In addition, you've got this blurring into popular practices. And there's a tendency to take anything that doesn't fit in the standard category, say, of Catholicism, and then you say, well, that's popular Catholicism. And it becomes part of a broader category of popular religion. But that's a very problematic and artificial definition, to take parts of religions and label it popular just so you don't have to deal with the fact that it's messy. In addition, if you want to say what's the majority religion in Brazil, you could say it's healing. Because what the people are after in all these different religions is ritual services. And if they're going to a bunch of different places for the same thing, maybe we should be looking at what they're all seeking rather than the labels we use for the particular houses they do it in. But in terms of popular religion, it starts to get complicated immediately. Top left is Corpus Christi. Well, that's a classic Orthodox Catholic ritual, right? Not so much. This is sanctioned by the diocese. It ends at the bishop's see, but it's put together by lay people. And when the guy who put it together retired, this tradition stopped. Now just a few people walking with candles in the street. So the most interesting parts of this religion were popular, not official. On the top right is the Malhação de Judas. They light him on fire because he betrayed Jesus. That ritual's died out. That's a picture I took in the beginning, the very first year I was an exchange student in Brazil. Little did I imagine I'd be talking about it in this context. On the bottom is Finados, the All Souls Day. So there's Catholics, there's Kardecists, there's people who are neither. And one of the people I interviewed told me this story. On All Souls Day, Finados, he was at his parents' house. And he wandered into the living room. No one else was in the sitting room. People don't usually hang out there. He went over and poured himself a glass of peach liqueur, sat down and smelled it and drank it. And then he sat up and said, "Why am I drinking this? I hate peach liqueur." And I can vouch for that. I've sat at the same table. He doesn't drink much. If he does, it's just a beer. But then he knew why. Because his grandfather liked peach liqueur. His grandfather was in the house. Notice the way he thinks. There was no question of this not being true because he had empirical proof of it. So notice the whole idea of evidence, of proof, of warrant, of how people justify claims starts to be a big part of how we interpret people. And another place where we have to avoid our own assumptions. Is this religion or not religion? The story is this family had enough money to pay this sculptor to make this small child, not because they'd lost a member of their family who was young, but they just thought it was a beautiful sculpture. They bought it from. And the sculptor's family had enough money to send him to Italy. So he is the best sculptor in the region. So there's nothing really religious there. But almost as soon as the sculpture was there, as far as I can tell, back 40 or 50 years, people have been going and putting soothers there. Women who are having trouble getting pregnant will take a soother there. You can see a small rosary there as well. So is it a Catholic tradition because there's one rosary there? Is it religious? Is it a pop? It's really hard to categorize, but one thing it does tell us that the lines we put in place to divide things into more or less orthodox are much more fluid than we think. This is one of the other spirits that I'm told is guiding my research process, and I owe a Barbie doll if I ever actually get a book on Brazil published, or maybe I should take the Barbie doll first in order to get some more momentum. Maria Terezinha died of food poisoning after going to a birthday party. Very tragic. Within a couple of weeks, Kardecists brought letters to the family because her spirit had appeared in that religion. Not long after, Catholic benzedetas. So benzedetas is a woman, usually an elderly woman, sometimes an elderly man, who offers healing, counseling, the cleaning of the aura thing, which they would not describe that way, which comes from Kardecism, which comes from mesmerism. So it's Catholic, it's popular Catholic, it's got esoteric elements, and it has the spirit of this little girl. Umbanda started to find this girl popping up on the days dedicated to children, especially the day of Cosmos and Damien, which is Umbanda Halloween. I took my 4-year-old daughter to see them once, and she knew the medium personally. She was a bit, that's sort of borderline unethical research work, but I took my wife, who's a pediatrician, to make sure, because she knows this woman as well. And my daughter came out not that confused at all. I wanted to see what she thought about talking to a woman who was not the woman who she knows socially, because she's talking to a spirit in the woman. She was mainly just interested in the candy. So what do we do with this? Here's the same spirit appearing in 3 different religions. Or there's a ritual when my eldest daughter got sick, Kardecists came in immediately to give pass. Catholic family, but the grandfather was interested in Kardecism. And then it needed something more powerful. They took a couple of T-shirts that belonged to my daughter to a Kardecist center, and the T-shirts was blessed. Wearing the shirt is good for health. I took a shirt to the Umbanda Terreiro, where no one else in the family would go. Same ritual. You can also take the same shirt to a Neo-Pentecostal church in town, and they'll bless the shirt. So here we have a healing ritual that is not only in different Spiritist traditions, but is in Pentecostalism. In all cases, not at the center, off to the side by the door. But once again, we find healing at the center of what people are doing, and religious categories getting in the way. Here are the first religions of all the people I interviewed when they were young, their family's religion, mainly Catholic. Notice no Umbandists at all. And here are their current religions when I interviewed them last year. So there's a couple of interesting things here. First, you could probably guess there's going to be more medical doctors in the no religion category, and there's going to be more alternative practitioners in the Kardecism and Umbanda category, and that is the case. So we start to see there is a bit of a polarization. So it's not like we've got a totally relativistic split. We have sort of a bimodal curve, but it is a curve. It is a bell curve. It's hard to, any division's kind of artificial, but we're starting to see this polarization. Some of the people converted because they saw spirits. So I was interested in why people became Umbandists, because that religion is more disrespected in this town. People aren't entirely happy with Umbanda, even though it's white Umbanda in the sense of Kardecist influence. One of the terreiros that's the most powerful. The music is New Age flute music. Spirits are very quiet. When they incorporate, they come up and touch the altar. They go, that's it. No yelling, no drums. Very quiet. I was disobsessed a few months ago at a place, a different ritual. So this fellow told me the story. How did he become an Umbandist? Catholic family. He was supposed to go out riding his motorbike with his friend. They skipped school. His bike wouldn't work, so he stayed to fix it. His friend died in a traffic accident. And he showed up in his living room that evening. And he could see him. No one else could see him. And it started to bother him that his dead friend was following him around, not saying anything. So what he did was he went to talk to an Umbandist medium. And the medium said, well, makes perfect sense. Your friend came to you. When people die violently, they're a bit confused. So he'll go back to someone he's familiar with. But we have to ask, don't worry about your friend, but what about you? You're seeing dead people. What are you going to do about that? You have to learn to deal with this. And he is now an Umbandist medium. For a while, he dropped it because his family doesn't like it, but he's back, and it's the most fulfilling part of his life. Receiving positive spirits who help other people in this tradition. So he moved from a Catholic family to that. So here's that other issue of what I called ritual polyphony. I got a couple of grants to study that in Minas Gerais. It's also common in Rio Grande do Sul, in the south. So this is not hybridity. These aren't people mixing different religions. This is not appropriation of another element of religion. These are one house or temple or terreiro or santo. One group of people, some variation, some people go to one but not the other, but usually the core people, same leaders running different religions on different days. Umbanda on Tuesday, Candomblé on Thursday. Once a year, the Congado rituals, or once a week or once a month, Quimbanda. So now the whole category of religion starts to seem really problematic because there is no religion. There are three different religions. So what's going on here? It's not about belonging to a religion. So Congado is in some of the groups. Candomblé Angola, because in this part of Brazil, it's mainly the Central African, not the West African. Umbanda, you get a sense of. Quimbanda is the left-hand black magic, practical sister, cousin religion of Umbanda. Difficult to know the origins. And interestingly, we did research in two different cities. In the south of Minas Gerais, we only had one person of the people we interviewed. We interviewed over 50 people who had anything apart from a lot of anxiety to even talk about Quimbanda. One person admitted it might be a spiritual path. In the north of the state, it's a core religious tradition, more important than Candomblé or Umbanda. And that reflects the different historical, that's the Wild West of Brazil. If there's a Wild West in Brazil, it's the north of Minas Gerais. No law, might is right. You had to have power and magic on your side. And still some of the great magical lineages that are passed on at great price to newer people receive a lot of politicians, mainly from Rio de Janeiro and Belo Horizonte, who come to get works that are going to help them in their political battles. So it's a mainstream religion there. So to understand these different religions, we had to look at the local context, the historical context. The pictures I showed at the beginning are from this house of Quimbanda. Mãe Isabel is, or was, the most famous head of a Congado. Congado is a processional tradition. And she is celebrated as a symbolic figure in the reclamation of Afro-descendant identity in Brazil and the politics. And yet you cannot find a single one of many, many newspaper reports that mentions that she also has Umbanda in her house. There's one interview with her granddaughter that says it. So what's up with that? She's a symbol of Afro-Brazilian religion. There's people in Brazil don't accept that Umbanda is esoteric because they don't accept that Kardecism is esoteric. It's an Afro-Brazilian. Why is she held up as a guiding light of the African community when they're denying half of her Africanness? Well, that story leads us to compare it to other processional traditions. You can find processional traditions in different cities that are still caught in 1930s ideological discourse over races. The white group, the indigenous group, the black group, all marching together through the streets. So there's a lot of politics you have to understand what's going on with the religions. But the story of how her mother, Maria, got Umbanda is a great and I think helpful story. One day, she had Congado in her house. She was known as an important religious leader who took it seriously. And one day her neighbors came and said, come look. She went out to the front of the house, and marching down the very steep hill to her house was a group of people carrying the sculptures from the local Umbanda terreiro. And they stopped, and the Pai de Santo, who was old, had said, I'm ending, and my spirit has decided that you're taking over. And they walked in the house, and they're still there. The spirits knocked on the door. She accepted the charge. And now, since that moment, she and her daughter Isabel ran two different religions. So what's the origin? Well, the story there is the origin is the spirits chose this. There's a lot of other groups. A more interesting person to talk to is Guaraci, who is the Pai de Santo of this, one of the oldest terreiros in Belo Horizonte. Now, you might look at him and say it's a white guy, but even race is a somewhat fluid category. He was the only Caucasian child adopted among 12 children adopted by his mother who ran this terreiro. And he was the only one who stuck with the religion, who learned everything. And he was there when she died. So he inherited the terreiro. But he's also doing a PhD in religious studies. So he was part of my research team. So I could sit down and talk to him. And the way he describes it makes a lot of sense, which is that what we find in these multi-religious terreiros is a story of the supernatural recognizing the authority of a local religious leader. And the result is that they have stronger offerings in a religious marketplace. They have more ritual services to offer, more healing powers to offer. So notice where we see then is the category of religion is not useful, but this other category of healing practices that comes to be useful for seeing what's going on across different religious boundaries. So to summarize that up then, we've got people moving around, people belonging to different religions. We've got the fact that horizontally religions blur into each other, pull into popular religion. We've got vertical blurring where you can't trust the categories. So religion's not that useful a category. Here's the latest terreiro of Umbanda that just opened last year. I was fortunate to be there on opening night. Here's hybridity. So the top right, the caboclos, powers of nature, top left, Pretos Velhos, but also the Virgin Mary, the Black Virgin Mary of Brazil. Bottom left, Oxóssi, Omalu, healing, Xangô, the three wise men over in the right, Iemanjá. So you've got compassion on one axis and nature on the other axis, a very complicated sort of mixing. So which is it? What do we do? How does the idea of hybridity help us to make sense? What is hybridity? Here's the usual model, and I would argue this model causes more problems than it's worth. And once we drop it, we learn an important methodological lesson. So if you have a hybrid practice of any sort, or a religion and it's hybrid, the usual account is that you're describing a historical process. That somewhere in the past, two religions came together either in a full-on collision that produced a mixture, or one appropriated for the other, or one imitated. There's a whole bunch of things, but you're having a historical account. There are several problems with that. The first problem is the history is not always clear, like Umbanda. We don't know where it came from. Second problem is this places scholars as the adjudicators of the authenticity or mixedness of traditions. And the third problem is it sends us chasing after reified categories in order to describe what it is we're studying. It really doesn't matter whether something's a mix. So Kelly's work with the Vale do Amanhecer, if you talk to people there, get this from reading your work, they're not telling the story of hybridity, they're telling the story of revelation. But if you dig deeper, you find a story of historical influences. But is that really important? It's like the idea of a tradition. If someone invents a tradition, it doesn't matter that it's invented as long as people believe it. And if you have a tradition that's totally authentic, but people don't care about it, then it's useless. So really the status of where a religion came from, like the status of the origin of words, is not always very helpful. Here's how I think of hybridity. Hybridity is a semantic finding relative to categories that we bring to the field. The categories aren't real. They're just second-order constructs that we impose. So when I'm talking to someone in Umbanda, some of their discourse might start using words like orixá. Well, I know that word comes from candomblé. If they use the word inquisi, well, that comes from a different type of candomblé. And they talk about the passe, or the passe magnético. Well, that comes from Kardecism. So I'm not saying that there's a mixture here. I'm saying that in order to interpret the tradition, the semantic connections, the ideas, the way words relate, the way practices, this is Kardecism, comes from mesmerism, it's in Umbanda. I don't hypothesize that there was any particular type of influence because I just don't know. But I find that my categories are being transgressed. So the hybridity is not in the phenomenon. The hybridity is the fact that I'm crossing my own categorical boundaries. So then I have to see, do these people draw boundaries? Do they fit with my boundaries? And the whole thing is tracing a semantic network, not finding the truth of religions. So here, for example, what is this? The first word, cartas, is tarot cards. So clearly we're dealing with esotericism, leads back to Eliphas Levi in the 1800s. But then the second word is bujus, cowrie shells. Now that's candomblé. So now we're not in esotericism anymore. We're in African religion, which is it? But really, they're both forms of divination. So now we need to move to the ritual category to find our category. But then the next thing, amarração de amor, that's just if your love is unrequited, you could pay someone to try to requite it for you, to get them to turn their emotions in your direction. So that didn't work. Trabalhos, well, that's a word that points to Afro-Brazilian traditions. Spirituais, that's a word that points more towards New Age traditions. The area codes from a city in a different state, that points towards African traditions. The fact that it's on the main shopping street, the upper class shopping street of the city, tells us something about the market. So to interpret this, we just follow it where it leads, and it leads all sorts of weird directions. So we don't reify any categories, including the category of popular religion. So here's a somewhat hybrid Umbanda altar. If you read this, you see a couple of ex-votos, which is relatively rare in Umbanda. It's since you've got a more Catholic influence here. But if you go in the back room, you've got aromatherapy, crystal therapy, Bach flower remedies. So this is esoteric Umbanda, one of the three meanings of that word, according to Brazilians. Esoteric in a sense, you've got New Age rituals mixed up in Umbanda. So which is it? It doesn't help to say that at some point New Age mixed, but it helps to say that these people found it useful for their reasons to appropriate that terminology. So we have to ask, why did they use it? What are they selling in a sense? How did they think people are going to read that category? So the methodological shift is from trying to trace characteristics of a religion based on our pre-understanding of what we should find in that religion, and then decide this isn't what I expected to find, so it's popular or heterodox, or this is what I expected to find. We forget our categories and just trace things where they lead, and the result is an interpretation. Uses categories in a sort of a heuristic manner, which again is one reason I'm so happy to be here with this group, because that sort of approach is built in from the ground up in CAS-E. Let's start. We got to start somewhere. Here's where we'll start. And it could change as we go. Let's see. Let's bring in some interesting people, see what we're talking about. Who knows where this is going to end up? And that openness is, I think, useful. So here's a handout. Alternative practitioners, Spiritist practitioners. And you can sort of figure a couple of these are probably the doctors. But it starts to get a bit hard to figure out who's saying what here. I don't want to take too much time here. I'll speed it up a bit. Here's your answers, though, and some of them are. The point is to realize that I expected to find sharper distinctions than I did. I was a bit surprised at some of these interviews.
So what's the task?
What was that?
We have to match them, or do we just
You've got the numbers at the bottom of the page, and you put the number in the right blank, then you have found which practitioner said which thing.
Yeah, it's just going fast. The answers are given.
Good. Well, let's start looking at some of these issues then. Here is a surgeon and endoscopist's idea. I explicitly ask people about esotericism, esoteric. What is the word esoteric? Do you see your tradition as esoteric? Do you identify in any sense with practices that you would label as esoteric? And I got a bunch of interesting answers, but I didn't bring up the word rationality once because I wanted to leave it open to see what might come. This was the only sentence spoken by any of the people I interviewed that used the word rational or irrationality. So that's clearly not an emic term. Doesn't mean it's not a good ethic term. But notice this, when she said this, I started to impose my preconception of what rational means. But look at this, same person. This is a person with no religion who's trained medical practitioner. So what's up with that? Clearly, she doesn't mean rational in the way. I have to see what she means by rational. And to be honest, it never became entirely clear. But yeah, the font's hurting us here. But she seems to mean that rational is something that has a foundation, and certain types of religious practices are not empirically grounded. But paranormal activities are empirically grounded. So clearly she's drawing the line in a different way than most of the other people I talked to. Then I coded for different views of the relationship between alternative and allopathic medicine, and I found 5 different categories. So some people say they're on the same level, they work together, you need them both. That was one view. Some people had a view of encompassment where alternative therapies have the whole truth, and the materialistic medicine of the allopaths is too limited. So that's placing the alternative medicine in a higher position. Another one was supplementarity, where allopathic medicine, mainstream Western medicine, is the most important one. But we have to be honest that faith and religion can help a bit with the immune system. So faith can add a little bit, but what's really important is allopathic. Then there were a couple of outliers. One person said they're the same. One person said they're independent. Nobody had anything to say about conflict, tension, marginalization, exclusion, not a word, in terms of their own views. And here's what we found in the group. In terms of numbers, not surprisingly, only alternative professionals saw supplementarity as the case. Not surprisingly, or rather, only medical doctors saw that medicine as the most important. Only Spiritists saw Spiritism as the most important. But somewhat surprisingly, most of the people saw them as complementary, including all of the people who were practicing in both traditions. 3 people mentioned conflict when I pressed them on it. One was ear, nose, throat specialist who was also an acupuncturist. And she said she doesn't have much problem because she was trained in acupuncture as an allopathic tradition. But a couple of times her patients asked her why she abandoned medicine. And she just corrects them and says it is medicine. And one person said that in Brazil, they may criticize you, but they don't push you away, which tells us a lot about the social context, which is one reason why we find perhaps less conflict than we might expect. But this one person who for over 20 years had 2 simultaneous professions, he was a homeopathic doctor and an anesthesiologist, had criticism from a couple of colleagues. So there was the only real tension in the whole thing, but it wasn't part of his view. It's a couple of colleagues, and he just didn't talk to them, so they got along fine. So this is a Catholic women's group that a woman on the picture on the left had a vision of the Virgin Mary at this tree, which she called the Tree of Energy. They had their own group. And I was interested in the fact that this group, in my view, should not have been able to stick together for almost 15 years, because there was a Kardecist in the middle who told me, or Donna Bene, who runs the group, overheard her and chewed her out quite vituperatively because she was confusing my research. She said, every time they use the word Jesus, I substitute the word Bezerra de Menezes, who was a 19th century Brazilian doctor, a Kardec of Brazil, who since he died has come back in many to help spiritual healers. So that doctor reappears second only to Dr. Fritz, the hard to verify historical doctor who worked with Zéarigo. So this group is a healing group. It was founded to pray for the youth of the city. And it doesn't fit into the category of popular religion either. So this is another case where, despite the many miracles, and this is where the Virgin Mary is on my side, it isn't really orthodox. It isn't really popular. It doesn't fit into any of the categories. It forces us even to rethink the category of popular religion. in the paper I published on this group, I drew attention to this idea that the reason they get along, because in Brazil, it's not so much that you're afraid of chewing other people out, but you're accepting of other people's differences. So that social valuation of getting along together explains why these people got along together. And I think that also explains part of why I'm not finding the Umbandist mediums criticizing the doctors and the doctors criticizing the Umbandist mediums. So the idea of competing rationalities, we have to, as is built into CAS-E's program, really look at the cultural context. Another thing I coded for was criteria of healing. So what is doing the healing? Why is healing taking place? And there is, again, the polarization, no real conflict, but let's look at those numbers. This is in percentage terms. So spiritual was just a word that was used a lot. And if I couldn't code it as something else, it was the code left over. That's why there was a lot of it. Karma is your past lives are affecting it. Progress is a different thing, a teleological view. When you leave your path of spiritual progress, that hurts your health. When you get back on your path of spiritual progress, you're healthy again. But notice on the right here, energy, materiality, and faith, those three. And here's what the doctors said, exactly the opposite at the other end of the spectrum. So again, we find clearly a bimodal sort of distribution. These people are thinking in different ways, but it's hard to call them sharply competing discourses or registers or orders because there's no sharp line between them because they overlap. So a category to hold this one's in this category, this one's in this category is not going to do the right work for us. One way to think about it is to look, for example, at the idea of causality and cognitive theories of magic, which say that there are non-scientific modes of causal thinking, like sympathetic magic, for example. And that varies culturally. Where you've got a society that imposes science as a hegemonic view in a classic Gramscian Althusserian view, when the school system and the media are drilling science into people's mind as scientism, you will have a greater tension between esoteric and religious views, esotericism and science. But in other countries where this isn't the case, we could expect less. So there's one hypothesis and one reason to look at modes of causality in a characterization of a cross-cultural view of rationalities. I also looked at the contrast between the healing practitioners' views of healing. So more individual for the doctors, they're part of teams, but each one brings their own individual specialization. Protocols above all. When there's an emergency, the protocols break down, but everyone follows the protocol. And a very narrow expected view of causation. Once again, we find two things. We find the polarization, and then at the alternative end, there's a lot more variety going on. So for alternative views, group intervention is central. There are scripted rituals, but they tend to be scripted at a fairly high level with lots of room for improvisation. So I talk to people who are literally surprised in a semi-conscious trance state, which is the case in most Umbandist mediums. They are surprised when they see how the entity in their body is handling a certain healing, almost like they would have gone a different way with that. Interesting. Now, of course, this is a retrospective construction of that experience, but it's interesting to see the medium surprised at the improvisation of the spirits as they deal with different cases in unexpected ways, and a much, much larger range of views of what causes disease, endogenous and exogenous, curses, spirits refusing to follow your call, and a more plural view of final cause. Off the bottom here is also spiritual progress, but also group support, as we find in healing traditions in many places around the world. And Paul knows much more about this than me. Many healing traditions heal the group as much as the individual. And that balance is central to the tradition. I also coded for how people saw their views being justified. And I think this is another dimension that's really useful for cross-cultural comparison. So why do you believe what you believe? Why do you think other people should believe what you believe? What do you tell your patients if they have any questions. And once again, we find polarization and more variety at the alternative end. The issue of divination is interesting. I'll come back to that in a sense. So here's the sort of model I work with. The categories are there, but they're only there to set up a comparative framework. And within that context, we find the data points sort of spread out, overlapping. So it's not like the categories are meant to capture what the people are doing. That's just not going to work. What the categories are meant to do is an artificial second-order academic construct meant to fine-tune our focus. So we're looking at certain sorts of things that are built into our heuristic, almost certainly polythetic, a list of points. They don't all have to be there. Some could be there. A very fluid idea of a definition. And the function of the definition is not to capture the essence of what we're defining. The function of the definition is to guide our research, guide the way we interpret things. So a given claim, if I trace, say, a reference to energies, in other words, energy is going to go and tapped into different things in medicine and tapped into different things. And so the one word starts to spread out in different directions, or the word current. It means one thing for the doctors and something else for the Umbandists. We get pulled in different directions. When I asked people about esoteric, this was the one place where the doctors were particularly prolific. This is the one place where it was not the alternative practitioners who were all over the map. And I am New Age, that's just what esoteric means for Umbandists. So some people just knew that meaning. But a third of the people I asked said they never used that word for anything in any context. 2 people had no idea what the word esoteric meant. And the rest of them were just riffing. They were just telling me what they thought. I thought, well, if you want me to go on about that, I'll go on about that. And the doctors, if you look at it, though, what they're saying is it's the opposite of their criteria for justifying claims. That they have a list of this is how you justify claims, and anything else is esoteric. So that's esoteric then is used precisely as a marker of a divergent discourse. And it helps interpret that earlier doctor who believes in the paranormal and sees esoteric as something without foundation. That's exactly what we're seeing here. It doesn't have an epistemic foundation. So, here's the summary, but I want to tell you 2 stories to end. First, one thing I haven't seen in the documents yet, maybe it's in a new one, and something I haven't, I'm not familiar enough what everyone's been doing here, but conversion, I think, is a point to look at this issue of crossing some sort of epistemic boundary. And one of the people I talked to, who was a trained fireman in the military police and an Umbandist medium, told me a really interesting story. He didn't say rational, he said empirical and scientific. That's how he was trained. His wife, since childhood, was called to be an Umbandist medium. Together they left Catholicism for Presbyterianism, then she went full on into Umbanda, and he went with her. So he attended Umbanda regularly for years. So he knew as much about his Umbanda as most Umbandas. It's not like he didn't know. He knew the talk, he knew the chants, he knew the entities, he knew the entitology, he knew the rituals. But he wouldn't believe. He refused to believe. He said, I just don't have proof. One day, a crisis in the house happened. Their young daughter, had not slept for 3 nights. They gave her medication. She wouldn't sleep. They were totally freaked out. And then his wife said, I don't care about you and your allopathic doctors. I'm calling in, and she called in a friend of hers. So the friend came, another Umbandist medium. So this medium pulled the negative entity out of the child that was causing her problems and put it into his wife, who's the other medium. But it wasn't the medium who drew it out. A spirit in the medium drew out the other spirit and placed it. So then there were 2 mediums with 2 spirits fighting it out in a almost physical yelling match to see who was stronger. In the front of this man who demands proof, and his daughter, who he said to me, at that point I knew there was no way she was going to be going to sleep that night. But once the evil entity was sent out, the daughter started yawning and went to bed. But he didn't see that as proof. He had a number of rationalizations of what was going on there. Other people, I have a friend of mine who is absolutely convinced spirits work because he saw the Brazilian equivalent of a Ouija board work twice. That's a pretty low level of proof. And this experience, you think, would be a high level of proof, but it wasn't enough for him. But he went to the terreiro one day, and he said, I don't believe in this nonsense. He went up, went through the ritual, got blessed, same as always, sat down, and he was thinking to himself, I would only ever believe a spirit if they could actually tell me. And in his head, he sort of, that he has these doubts and a couple of other very specific points. Unless they could get to this level of telling me what's going on, I won't believe. Then he was called up. Almost never happens in Umbanda, called back up. And the spirit said to him, you don't believe. Stop putting down the spirits. And she told him the 3 points. And he says at that moment, his legs buckled. He started crying and he ran out of the room. He was converted. But notice what happened there. It wasn't a learning. He already knew both points of view. But at that point, he experienced a sort of a cognitive shift, which could be interpreted as a reorientation of the salience that he gave to a whole bunch of connections and the ideas that were in his head. He shifted. Now, we could see that as a crossing of a sharp boundary, or we could see that in a way as following the same kind of methodology that I'm talking about here, just tracing shifts. It's the ones that he was not taking seriously, he valued in a new way. The other ones that he had valued, he revalued in a different way. He didn't learn anything new, but he shifted from one rationality to another. Perhaps that's one way to describe it. So cultural variation is important. The intersectional aspect of this is important. So when Kelly's talking about Vale do Amanhecer, they try to give, I get this from your book, they tried to give material help where they could, but they didn't have much money. They gave a lot of spiritual help. But you look at Kardecists, which is the 3rd highest economic class in Brazil in terms of religion, they give money. They can. Class is an important part of why certain people achieve status through spiritual healing. And doctors tend to come from upper class families. Let me end with one story which illustrates another sharp boundary and a phenomenon I was talking to Kelly about that's just turning up in Umbanda in the last couple of years, which is the presence of extraterrestrials as spirits. And when I talked to one woman from the centro where this is happening, I made the mistake, because this was a senior member, of assuming she was in on this. And she was offended. She just she refused to be interviewed. We'd set up an interview. She told me that I was disrespecting the tradition, that she just tore a strip off me. Because I had mentioned, this is a woman who believes that mermaids incorporate into people, but extraterrestrials will be on. That's very interesting, beyond the pale. So a woman who is a nurse who hands doctors their tools at her professional job in the hospital, and when she goes to the Umbanda Center, a nurse who hands the doctors their tools in spiritual surgery. One night she went to her boyfriend's house. There was a bright light that woke her up. Rough part of town, there was a crack house across the street. She went out, she sat up, and then a small ET, one of the lizard people, came in and ran its fingernail along her foot. She went up quietly into the living room, and there were 4 kangaroo aliens, one as tall as the roof, one a bit smaller, and 2 very small ones. And then the large kangaroo started running towards her. And then she was protected by a white light, which she knows is the white light of her community, of her training, protecting her. But then she woke up. At that point, I would be inclined to think it was a dream. But she thought it was an unusual dream, so she sought empirical support. So she went to a friend of hers. 2 of them have worked together as healers since the 15th century. And this other woman is a Kardecist. So she took the case, said, take this case to your table in another religion and get back to me. And her friend came back, you were totally right. That was the spirit of a drug trafficker from the other side of the road who that very night had been cut into pieces. And that death was so traumatic, he came back here because he was dating the woman who works in this house. So he identified the location. And he said that your light saved him. Instead of being lost in the sort of spirit zone, which Kardecists believe in, the umbral, it shocked him into realizing that he had to move on with his spiritual path. So she got a deep thanks from this dead a drug trafficker from a different religion. And for her, that was absolute empirical support for her view. But notice, where is the tension? Where is the epistemic boundary? Where is the alternative or competing rationality? It's not between Umbanda and Kardecism. It's not between any of those religions and science. It's between some people in this group who are open to ETs and other people standing right beside them in the same group who aren't open to ETs. And if we get down to that level of difference and try to reify it as some sort of competing rationality, the term has sort of lost all meaning. We have to find some level. And of course, I think the only answer is to make it a stipulated definition. Admit we're just dealing with a category, as is built into this project from day one, a category that is meant to orient research, not to capture any realities. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.